Good evening, everyone. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the Executive Director of Karis Circle. Karis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Karis Books, and Karis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We're very excited to welcome E.G. Crichton in conversation with Alexandra Teixeira Riggs for a discussion of matchmaking in the archive, 19 conversations with the dead, and 3 encounters with ghosts. It includes 25 pages of vivid images and documents this monumental creative project. It adds essays by Jonathan Katz, Michelle T., and Chris Vargas, who describe their own unique encounters with the ghosts of LGBTQ history. Today's event is co-sponsored by the Digital Media Graduate Program at Georgia Tech. And we are also in debt to our friend Morna Gerard, who is a connector in our community and helped make this happen. So we're very, very glad to know Morna. The Digital Media Graduate Program at Georgia Tech provides students with a foundation in digital media design and making, a theoretical background in digital media, and the opportunity to practice what is learned in studio courses, labs, and research. They focus on the socio-cultural context of digital media making, where graduate students learn to make with meaning. So first, I'm going to introduce Alexandra. Alexandra uses she, they pronouns and is a PhD student in the digital media department at Georgia Tech, concentrating in design research, queer media studies, and critical archive scholarship. Their work focuses on using interactive storytelling methods to explore both past and present notions of queer community, identity, and belonging. She combines queer methods and design research for both tangible and screen-based interfaces to challenge dominant technologies and offer alternative relationalities, in both on and offline space. They are currently working with Dr. Ann Sullivan and Dr. Nora Howell at Georgia Tech. For her current research, she is also working with archivist Morna Gerard in the Gender and Sexuality collections at Georgia State University. And the person of the hour tonight is E.G. Crichton, who uses she, her pronouns. She's an interdisciplinary artist living in Richmond, California. Her work has been exhibited and presented in Australia, Japan, the Philippines, Great Britain, France, Italy, Portugal, and across the United States. Crichton is a professor emerita of art at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and served as an artist in residence at the Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, Transgender Historical Society from 2008 to 2014. So welcome to you both, and welcome to all of our friends watching from around the world. We want to encourage y'all, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the question box, which is over here, the little Joker looking icon. Click that at any time and put your question in there. You can also put your question in the chat and I'll move it over so that they will be accessible to Ali and EG. But we are so excited. We know we have beautiful images to look at and a wonderful discussion. So I'm going to get out of the way so that we can get right to it. But thank you both so much for being with us during Pride Month so that we can get right into it.
Great. Yes, happy Pride. Thank you so much, ER, for the wonderful introduction. And before we go ahead, I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen so we have some imagery up. Okay, great. Hopefully everybody can see that. So this is the book cover. So let's kick us off with a couple of questions for EG. So thank you, first of all, EG, for sharing your incredible work, for meeting with us, and for talking with me about it. I'd like to start off by asking you about the title of the book, which we see here, Matchmaking in the Archive, 19 Conversations with the Dead and 3 Encounters with Ghosts. So first of all, who are these 19 dead and who are the 3 ghosts? And second of all, why archives? And as an artist, what led you to work with archives and particularly archives of the deceased?
Ali, thank you so much for organizing this. And I'm really happy to be in Atlanta, sort of. And thank you, Karis, for sponsoring this. So yeah, the title was meant to be provocative, so I'm glad it raised that question. The 19 conversations are conversations, and you can start to show the boxes, conversations between individuals who have died and whose archive boxes contained materials like these. So these are the boxes that I became intrigued with. And each one represents an individual that then became in relationship to a living person, and that relationship became a kind of conversation. The three ghosts in the title have to do with three guests that I invited to write short essays that ER mentioned. And each one of them coincidentally talked about queer ghosts. So archives, you know, I think I've always been an archive nerd without necessarily using that language. And I've always been interested in the sort of individual lives of ordinary individuals who've died. So for years, I was obsessed with graveyards. And actually, Karen Sharman will appreciate this. I'm showing a graveyard that's outside of Sydney, Australia there. But anyway, I spent years going through graveyards and and it generated a number of projects. So I consider a graveyard a kind of archive. And then other just examples of archives, clapping chants and jump rope rhymes, what I call girl culture. I'm a scavenger. I collected all kinds of books on perversion and sexuality that are usually out of date and usually contain atrocious views, but that's generated material for my work. So I consider that a kind of archive. And this is a fraction of a piece that I was really interested in case histories. And so this is something that was on a turntable, but it's from an actual case history.
Can you say a bit more about case history? I'm just curious about that.
Well, I was really, my parents were very homophobic. And so I sort of became interested in, well, what did they read when they were younger? And I started researching books, case histories, magazines, all kinds of material that were generally from usually the mid 1900s, but the whole century starting with the late 1800s, and started just sort of, I wasn't sure what I was doing with it, but in this case history here, it's very clear to me that this is about a lesbian. I just found it very kind of visceral that in this case history that she felt she couldn't feel her lower body, that it was such a fearful, anxious state of being. Mm. So I found that interesting. And I felt like, even though I wasn't the subject of the case history, I felt like I could have been.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it seems like this kind of trend in your artistic practice then kind of kickstarted the subject matter of the book. So I'd love to get more specifically into the work that started Matchmaking in the Archive. So you mentioned that the book is based on an art project. It's called Lineage, Matchmaking in the Archive. So I have a couple questions about that, just kind of tying together your interest in archives artistically and this new project that you had embarked on, 2008, I believe is when you started it. So why Lineage and why Matchmaking? So I'd love to hear a bit more about your process with the project, and as you're an artist, what it was like to work as an artist inside a historical society like the GLBT Historical Society of San Francisco.
Can you advance the slides? So this was the poster that I made for the project, which of course the book is based on, the book cover is based on. And that was a project that in 2008, I became an artist in residence. You can keep advancing. And, it was a desire on my part to sort of, as an artist, to work in a community context. I was really sick of the art world. And the GLBT Historical Society gave me incredible free access to the archives. And so in 2008, I just started wandering the aisles and kind of cruising and, trying to decide what would I generate as an art project. And I went through a million ideas and threw them out. But finally, those boxes that you showed earlier, are what caught my interest, you know, not the Harvey Milk collection, which is vast, or other people who are really well known, but these, you know, individual boxes, or in some cases more than one box, of individuals I'd never heard of. And I just, I became compelled by that. And I'm going to quote a little bit from my book about lineage. My concern is a problem, was and is a problem of inheritance. What happens to us when we die? Who will remember us? Will anyone even be interested? And no wonder. I come from an extended biological family that was separated by geography before I was born, and an immediate family of 7 that was emotionally fractured. My childhood was filled with an acute curiosity about all the secrets rendered mute by my parents. Secrets about death and mental illness, suicide, family feuds, buried racial and racist history. But my parents were just too busy and too uncommunicative to tell stories about their past that might have helped me situate myself. So, I was looking for a lineage. And then when I came out as a lesbian, I was clueless. It was, it was like 1970, 1971. I wasn't even all that aware of Stonewall. And I'm like, why am I a lesbian? And am I a real lesbian? And, nothing in my life was tethered to an awareness of queer history. And again, quoting from my book, I initially had this turbulent, fearful, and heady new identity, one that came to offer me a closer kind of family than I'd ever known. Somewhere in there was a desire for lineage, for queer roots. I didn't want my life to be yet another family secret, another line on my father's family tree that read spinster, another buried invisible existence. I understood viscerally why queer history is important and why it calls for intentional collecting to stave off the oblivion of invisibility. Lineage, I didn't really use that term before I started this project, but it was something I was looking for.
Yeah, that makes sense.
You asked about matchmaking too. Shall I just go on with that?
That
Guys,
sounds great.
Interrupt you for 1 sec. We're getting a lot of staticky. I don't know if it's moving papers on top of a laptop or if headphone. Yeah, okay. No, it's fine. We just want to be able to hear you.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you for interrupting. So I eventually came to the idea of connecting a living person to a dead person's archive. And I think partly that was a desire to widen my exploration. And I'm going to read again a quote. My attention turned to the physical presence of a person manifested through their artifacts, sorted by them or someone else and donated to the Historical Society. As with epitaphs, the contents of the boxes suggested incomplete narratives. I thought, well, what if I matched a living individual to the archive of someone who had died, fostering a generative relationship? I was drawn to the idea of forging my own relationships to the dead, then opening up each relationship to another person in a kind of 3-way connection. Matchmaking in this context held promise as a way to more deeply explore these archives of the dead, to open up their lives to the imagination of living participants. So I started to do it, and nobody I invited turned me down. Like it seemed to, and I invited a range of people. I started with people I knew, and then I thought, I started reaching beyond people I knew, and something captivated people, whether they were an artist, a writer, a performer, none of the above, something about a relationship to a particular person. And so what I was asking people was it was a blind date, really. I was bringing people to the archive, as you see here, and I would ceremonially bring out the box and introduce them to their person, and then I'd go leave them alone. And I told them that they could, if they didn't like this one, that they'd have one more chance, but nobody actually took me up on that. And I told them You don't have to like this person. You don't have to mourn them. That's already been done. All I want is for you to, through the artifacts that they left, to develop a relationship and then to invent some kind of response in any medium. And then I myself created formal portraits of each pair. And so that's what the next slides are showing. I've kind of put them all on one screen, several screens, but these portraits really became about the person performing their relationship to the archived person. I would project an image on the wall, and they were very lively sessions. So I tried to capture some of that relationship in these portraits.
They're really striking, and I love the way that you've kind of projected the image of the deceased person with the image of, or with the actual physical live person in front. It forms this really striking image. So I wanted to ask you a bit more about your role as an artist. So here we have the artists who are convening with the archives, but you are also the artist in matching them. So how does your role as an artist, how is that different from others who might be in the archives? So somebody like a researcher or a social scientist or a reporter or even a family member. How is being an artist in the archive different? And how is your perspective unique in approaching this?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question, because I actually had to answer that question for myself, and I really wasn't sure. I'm an interdisciplinary artist, and what that means to me is that I borrow and steal from all kinds of other professions. So, at times I do oral interviews that are kind of like a social scientist might do, or even a journalist. I was certainly a detective at different times, or at least my notion of a detective. So I feel like I owe a lot to those other professions. But what I really began to notice is how much information was left out. Like when I'd open a box that belonged to a person, it's not like there would be a little date range in the box that showed me when the person was born and when they died. A lot of times I didn't know if the person, when they lived or if they were dead. And a couple of times that was embarrassing. A couple of times I accidentally killed somebody off who showed up at a reception. But so what that, I just felt this constant curiosity and this constant need to find out more. And that would always, and also the more objective forms of reporting and archiving always point out the gaps to me. I felt like there was so much of a person's life that was invisible. And so that's where I felt like imagination and artists could contribute something that was different, that we could sort of flesh out the bones of the archive and make that person come alive. I have a quote about that I like. Each archive I write about suggests a unique narrative, one that is gathered and told and interpreted. The work of participants, the relationship between an archived person and a living person, gives that archive a body. Each box, each folder is filled with the possibility of touch, smell, sight, sound, the metaphorical taste of one person's life. So, I feel like that's artist terrain. Both my terrain as the director of this project and the people who I invited in, who had free reign to do whatever they wanted.
Right. I was going to say it seems a bit like a fabulation, or like a critical fabulation, the way that you're kind of interpreting this. And I was also going to ask, what are we looking at here? What is the space that?
Can you go back one? These are quotes from participants that I used on walls and in the book and in various ways. So interviewing my participants was an important aspect of this job. So in that case, I'm an interviewer. And then the next slide is the first show that I developed. So I designed these installations, and I also mimicked I felt like I was bringing the archive outside of the temperature controlled room into public viewing. So I'm using archive forms like the transparent boxes that you see in all these slides are ones I got fabricated that are mimic the standard archive box. The shelving is steel archive shelving that I painted white. So I'm a maker. I'm orchestrating events like this. There were people who performed. There were people who read poetry. So my role as an artist was really multifaceted. And I was a matchmaker. That was my new thing that I was adding to my skill set was being a matchmaker.
Yeah, it seems like the matches are a critical part of the making here. So, and it also seems like involving the community, bringing community together is also a critical part, at least for the shows that you have, and then also for the matches themselves. So, on the subject of the matches, let's talk about a couple of the matches because that's why we're all here today. No, I'm just kidding. We're celebrating the book, but we're all curious about the matches. So in the longest section of the book, you have these 19 matches, so the 19 conversations with the dead between a living participant and the archives. So can you talk about a couple of them? I know you've got a couple of specific examples that you'd like to talk about. And so my questions for these are, how and why did you match these two? And what kind of relationship did they end up forming? So what did the living, what kind of relationship did the living form with the deceased? And what were some of their artistic responses?
I'm going to let you advance through. I'm just going to talk about two of the matches. And I picked them for various reasons, but in Tina's case, Tina Takamoto matched to Jiro Onuma. This is an animation of different, I created mini portraits that I turned into this animation just to give people a sense of how Tina was interacting with Jiro Onuma. Tina was one of the first people I matched, and I just had a sense that this would be their perfect archive. Jiro Onuma is one of the oldest archives in the Historical Society collections. And his archive is very small, but it's really, really fascinating. And he came when he was 19 years old to this country, and we don't know exactly why. He came with his father, and he brought the photo album that you see at the bottom there. And the things in his archive show that he was a physical exercise, not in the sense that he was athletic, but in the sense that he followed the sort of softcore porn of the day, which were these male exercise magazines, male muscle building. And, you can see in his documentation, which is in the archive too, certain racist tropes of the time. I mean, never married, and then it calls his complexion sallow. So he came as an immigrant and as a Japanese immigrant, and in 1945 he was carted off to a camp in Utah. In the picture on the right, you can see the guard tower. He also collected, this is a postcard in his collection, which is a flat postcard with this little gold penis pin that punctures the card, which made me laugh. So Tina really got into this archive and spent a lot of time. They had their partner's mother translate the backs of photos from the kanji characters into English. This is Jiro Onuma, who worked in the dining hall of the camp. And you see him on the lower right. And he was a baker. He worked in the bakery. So Tina really immersed themselves into Jiro Onuma, and really, more than anybody almost, really developed a relationship and is still making work that stems from this original connection. Tina's piece was called, can you go back one? Was called Gay Bachelor's Japanese American Internment Camp Survival Kit. So it was whole piece was kind of an act of empathy. And, Tina felt like I heard a lot growing up about the internment camps, but I never heard about anything about what it would be like to be queer in an internment camp. So Tina basically studied the kinds of crafts and materials that were accessible to people in the camps and fabricated things out of those materials, taught themselves how to do it, and then fabricated things. So here you have some of the portraits. On the right is one of the exercise things where he would keep track of his exercise. He was taking an actual course, and this was a scroll to keep track of it. And Tina's fabricating all of this. The medal from Earl Laderman's Physical Culture School, that's made out of Play-Doh, I think. The exerciser that Tina made out of rubber and found wooden handles. Tina came to me a couple of times with injuries from these things. I mean, Tina literally taught themselves how to carve things. So these birds are carved, and used lemon juice to burn text into paper. And then Tina finally did, outside of this project, did this amazing video to an ABBA record where it's everything you read here. It was a drag show. It was Tina used footage from World War II taken in the camps, and it's both poignant and really hilarious. And I'm going to quote Tina now. "I have always been skeptical about matchmaking and blind dates, but when the artist E.G. Crichton declared that my perfect match was a deceased gay Asian American dandy named Jiro Onuma, I was intrigued. Crichton set up my first blind date with Onuma at the GLBT Historical Society in San Francisco, where his personal collection resides. Compared to some of the other collections in the archive, his is rather modest, making the details of his life quite spare and mysterious. All of his materials fit into a slim 6-inch wide file box containing 2 photo albums, some personal documents, and papers, an assortment of homoerotic ephemera." Throughout the process, Takamoto continued to ask the question, and I quote, "Is it possible to form personal and affective attachments to queer individuals and absent memories through the objects and materials they have left behind? This mode of working through the archive reflects not only my own longing for a connection to Onuma's material, but also my grief over the impossibility of fully reanimating his partial and fragmented traces of remembrance."
That's beautiful. And I know that tends to be a theme with a lot of the participants, with a lot of the artists, is this line between kind of reanimating or or kind of imposing ourselves onto the deceased. But before we get to those questions, I wanted you to talk a bit about a second match. So Alyssa Perry and Pat Parker was another really poignant one in the book that I know we have some examples of.
People may have heard of Pat Parker, who was a poet who lived in Oakland. For this match, I really broke my own rules. One of my rules was that it be an archive residing in the GLBT Historical Society. There was no Pat Parker archive. I found her in other people's archives, like Audre Lorde's archive. I found reference to Pat Parker, but there was no, and I'm like, why not? And so part of this was my desire to, I also was interested in diversifying the archives. And I wanted there to be a Pat Parker archive. And Alyssa was somebody I knew from Outlook magazine years before. And I was a little unclear about the ethics of creating an archive for Pat Parker. But when I talked to Alyssa, Alyssa was so enthusiastic and had such their own history with Pat Parker when they were 17 years old that I just thought this has to happen. So I don't have pictures of Pat Parker from an archive, but what I have are pictures of the piece that Alyssa created. And it was really a wonderful installation with a bed as the foundation. And I show details in the following slides about Alyssa actually wrote from her diary onto the sheets of the bed. When Alyssa was 17, she discovered a book of Pat Parker in a neighbor's bookcase, and immediately started gathering everything she could from Pat Parker's life, poetry books, and kept a diary. And so that diary, and this was Alyssa, trying to come out basically. And Pat Parker became her role model. Alyssa wanted to be a writer. I mean, Pat Parker really served a function in Alyssa's life that was really critical. So that's what this installation portrays. So you see both pictures and diary entries from Alyssa's life, but you're also seeing materials that she gathered from Pat Parker's life.
And then this is the portrait that you took of both of them.
One of them, yeah.
And here's a second view of that. Yeah, I was thinking, as I was kind of reading and looking more at the matches, I kind of found myself thinking about our own relationships with the archive. So we as kind of contemporary figures relating to the archive, and just thinking about what we might owe to it and how we kind of reconcile, like I was saying before, these desires of the deceased with our own desires. So we might want clarity, or we might want to own the narrative in the case of some family members that I was reading about, or we might want to see ourselves even reflected in their stories in the case now, especially of younger queer generations. So kind of on that subject, or in that vein, what do you think are kind of the ethics of how we navigate these desires of the deceased with our own in this kind of work, and the kind of nuances that come from that?
Good question. This came up a lot for me. It came up with Pat Parker because I found out that Pat Parker's family was holding on to her archive she died 20 years previous to this, because they're waiting for some kind of settlement, some kind of archive that will give them money that will help support Pat's two daughters. So Alyssa tried to reach out to them, and that was unsuccessful, but I was mindful of being respectful of their wishes, and unclear about how to deal with that. But I trusted Alyssa to be respectful of that. The next slide you showed is Helen Harder, who was a World War II flight instructor, somebody I had a historical crush on, who I matched to Bill DeMuncos, who made a short film based on one of her poems. But at some point, Helen Harder was a single mother, and her son, Aaron, after her archive was already in the archive, brought her vibrator from the 1940s and donated it to the archive. So I'm sitting here with this vibrator and decided to display it, which is what the next slide shows, in a box. And first of all, I found out that Aaron, the son, was coming to the reception for the show, and that made me incredibly nervous. I was like, oh my God, I hadn't had to deal with accountability to family members yet. So I was very nervous about that, and I was nervous about showing the vibrator. Aaron, apparently, he was really nice. He apparently loved it, and was fine with it. So that was a relief. But I felt much less certain that Helen Harder would have approved of her vibrator being shown. I'm quite sure she wouldn't have. But I sort of made a decision that my responsibility was to the living in this.
Yeah. And what period was this from?
1940s, I believe.
1940s, yeah.
Yeah, I think it still worked. A little frayed. The electrical was a little frayed, but yeah.
That's incredible. I know you've also talked about, for instance, Diane Huger and her archive, and and some of the desires that she had for her writing.
Yes, Diane Higuer, her archive was incredibly poignant and included notebooks with very, very personal writings in them. And they were hard to read. They were painful. Diane was disabled and in multiple ways, and just going through a lot of agony. And Dominica, who I matched to Diane, was very sensitive to this and also identified with it as somebody who was usually in a wheelchair when I met her. So Dominica didn't directly use Diane's writings, but I did at some point find that little note that said, can you go back one? That said, contains private writings, please don't disturb this. There was nothing on the box that prevented me from looking at it, but this note was sort of buried in the box. So anyway, that to me, that raised an ethical question. And then the thing that I think was most extreme, if you move on, was Veronica Friedman, who was a trans woman whose archive, very slim archive, no photos of her at all, who I matched to Barbara McBain. And this, some of what was in the archive were the poems like this that were fairly anxious poems, in this case on a red napkin. And the other thing in the archive were charts and graphs about gender, about, very sort of scientific information, enlightened and not so enlightened about gender. And first of all, I kept thinking of my dad and really had this strong desire to create a relationship between Veronica and my dad, because my dad was a high school science teacher who also left behind lots of notes and lots of notes about the gender of the specimens that he looked at. But the other thing was, I, out of the blue, got an email and then had a phone call with Veronica's daughter. And this was really, this was after me doing detective work to find out stuff. I did not expect that I would, independently of that research, hear from Veronica's daughter. Veronica was basically severed from all family ties soon after transitioning. And Shelley, the daughter, was only about 1 or 2 years old. But Shelley came to me because she went to the Historical Society. Shelley's grown up now, has their own family, their own kids, and was very upset by Veronica's archive and felt like it was presenting a very narrow view of her. Shelley, to her credit, used complicated genders to reference both her dad and Veronica, never knew her, but had a desire to know her. And I wanted to know my dad better too. And I hadn't been disconnected from my dad the way that Shelley was. But Shelley also didn't understand why that archive was important and asked the Historical Society if she could have it and give them copies. And of course, they can't do that. I mean, they're legally bound to this archive. And that's where I really didn't honor Shelley's wishes, in the sense that I felt like Veronica's life is a critical part of queer history and doesn't totally belong to, that family are not the only owners of this history. But it was upsetting that she was so upset, and there was no resolution to it. I think Shelley also felt concerned that people would judge her, even though she was only 2 years old or whatever. So that was kind of a complicated issue.
Yeah, that kind of brings up this idea that, on the one hand, you have the biological family members who might feel that they have a claim to the archive or to the stories even of their relatives, but then the individuals who are deceased might have never wanted that in the first place and might instead have chosen family members who they feel much more connected to. And in Veronica's case, this may have been what really was going on, but we'll never know. So it's interesting, and I think, you know, these kind of ethical questions will never really solve them, but that you have to kind of enter into the archive with the you know, knowledge that this is going to come up, that you're going to be swimming through this gray area. But anyway, so on a slightly different topic, and we can return to this afterwards, of course, if we have time at the end. This is a really fascinating topic that I struggle with a lot myself. But switching gears a little bit. So while I was reading the book, I was also thinking about this kind of role of desire or seduction. There's a certain seduction in the archive and in these materials that we come across, and in the matches. I mean, matchmaking itself even kind of refers, like you said, to dating or setting up almost a romantic relationship. So you're putting people on a blind date. So how do you kind of imagine this role of erotics or this kind of libidinal role or even the romantic playing into this idea of matchmaking? So how did that kind of influence the project and the participants? Were there some historical crushes, like you mentioned, for instance? And then lastly, kind of this idea of seduction versus voyeurism. So we're voyeurs to the archive, but we're also seduced by it. So is there a line, and how do we kind of navigate that?
Can you advance? Can you advance the slides? Yeah. So I'll give a few examples from the archives. Tammy Ray Carlin, who was matched to Joe Daly, definitely had a crush on Joe Daly. Joe Daly was an interesting San Francisco lesbian who actually was a police commissioner for a while, was an activist in various ways. Tammy Ray created these cut-ups on Manila archive folders, and they were very much a flirtation. So in this case, dear Joe, here we are in the back seat of your car. I'm giving you all my love to you. And there were 7 of these, like the idea of 7 days in a week, and her name was Joe Daly. Next one, my historical crush on Helen Harder. You know, what can I say? There she is in her uniform by her Piper Cub airplane, and then as an older, very handsome woman. So I think that's why I gave her to a gay man instead of a lesbian.
Were you afraid that they'd fall too in love? Is that what? Oh man.
And then Troy Boyd, who I matched to George Choi. George Choi was an AIDS activist and died of AIDS. And, you know, Troy really admired George's activism, his out there-ness about it, and ended up writing a letter as his contribution to the project, a letter to George. And in the letter, he openly acknowledged that he had a crush on him. And with me, Troy is a very shy person, but he opened up when we did the photo session, and he started talking about that. So I thought that was interesting. I felt like, yes, desire can cross that life-death boundary, and often does.
Yeah, it really does. And the letter was so poignant, the letter that he wrote. And I also realized that the two of them were born in the same year, at least in this case, in the case of this match. So it must have been very interesting for them to, or for him to relate to someone who was literally his same age, but died of AIDS.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. So I also, I mean, I definitely felt the seduction while I was reading the book. I'm sure I would feel differently if I were actually in the archives, but you can feel it. It's very palpable.
I'm going to read a couple of quotes that have to do with this whole thing, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, in general, as matchmaker, I found that there was plenty to get off on. In the tradition of older women who engage in this service, I researched different traditions of matchmaking and set about learning how to do it. In the end, simple hunches, demographics, and knowledge about shared interests steered my process. Sometimes I let an archive point me to a person. Other times, talking with a person pointed me to a particular archive. I learned how to launch relationships and invented the means to witness every detail of how they evolved. The dialogue, images, objects, music, and writing that emerged from these uncommon connections became my markers of success. It was a kind of archive midwifery, a highly voyeuristic, undoubtedly manipulative, and totally magical experience. So my own relationship to desire, and this is what the last chapter of the book is about, is sort of my personal connection to all these archives.
Yeah.
And also the evolution, another quote, the evolution of the accumulated work transformed many of us in ways we never anticipated. Spending time with the archive of someone who has died is an intense and intimate process. There is an ineffable sadness that occurs. Viewing someone else's artifacts makes us think about our own finite lives. Mixed with sadness, there was also an eroticism in touching the artifacts of a life, of entering a narrative that feels private. Would this person have been comfortable with this exploration of their life? Would they be insulted or offended? Was I prying too much? I asked these questions all summer in 2008 as I wandered among the archives of the dead. I wanted to know how participants would navigate these thorny issues, what would come out of the relationships I was fostering. I was eager to discover what would emerge from the recesses of the vault, and I wanted to be surprised.
And I'm sure you were surprised by quite a few.
Totally.
Yeah. And there's a really wide variety of different kinds of relationships that people formed. I mean, some people really didn't want to work with their matches, and then some people kind of fell in love. So yeah, so it really kind of paints this picture of all the different emotions that you might feel when walking into an archive. And so, you mentioned your final chapter, Lineages of Desire, and your own emotional connections to different archives. So what is that? What is that kind of personal connection for you? What is your personal stake in the archive, and how does that kind of reflect back on queer communities largely? For instance, those of us sitting in the room, or even a young researcher like myself. But yeah, your personal connection to the archive.
Well, I had personal relationships with particular archives that are autobiographical. But I also, at some point, started in the matchmaking process, started to feel kind of lonely, like, oh, everybody else is getting a match and I don't have one. And so I matched myself to somebody named Adrienne Fuzet, who was a lesbian curator, who I knew a little bit, who had curated my work into a couple of shows, and did a number of offshoots and projects that related to Adrienne's archive that were not directly part of the project. And then I mentioned before that I kept thinking of my dad, who had just died when I was exploring Veronica's archive. So three of us did Barbara McBain and Susan Working, and I did a project that was about that relationship between Veronica and my dad. And then these are all the notes my dad left behind, which is really a kind of archive. And Claude Schwab, who was another sort of World War II archive, worked for a radiological defense laboratory in San Francisco, in a neighborhood that I walked in every day with my dog. And in this neighborhood, you would see these warning signs about toxic waste material. So Claude, this archive person, was working on a project that actually really polluted this neighborhood that was largely a Black neighborhood. So, it raised issues of environmental racism. So in the last chapter, I sort of go into what these connections are.
Yeah.
And then
it's interesting. Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say it's interesting to kind of have you being able to reflect back on the places that you've personally lived in and visited, and known that these individuals in the archive also were around those locations, and kind of having that emotional memory.
Yeah, I mean, I tried to track a lot of things that never directly, like I found the house of one archived person that is referenced in their archive, and I didn't have an address or anything. I just had a picture, but I tracked it down. I mean, I did a lot of sleuthing, um, but the other thing that you mentioned is, in terms of my relationship to archives and desire, is I talk about my untended archive. So here I am, being an archive nerd and focusing on archives and really encouraging other people to deal with your archive, put it together, put it in a box, deliver it to the Historical Society, particularly trans people, women, and people of color. I wanted more, diversity in the archive. But have I done this with my own stuff? No. So, and for all the reasons that anybody avoids this kind of thing, it's hard to do. It's like hard to think about, when I die, what will be left? Will there be anything in the archive? It's a difficult thing. And I've started to go through stuff a little, but I haven't gotten very far. So I call it my untended archive.
Right. And maybe there's kind of a pay it forward where some young person comes in and works with you to tend it. But I joke. But I also wanted to ask you, so this book is part of a series called Q Plus Public. So I wanted to ask you a bit about that series, and if you could talk about that a bit.
Yes, this is a series that I want everybody to know about, and those of you who are writers to think about proposing books. It's a series of small books, what they call small books in the industry. And I developed this with Jeffrey Escoffier. It grew out of a project I did called Outlook and the Birth of the Queer. And so this is the editorial board. Jeffrey sadly died a year ago, and that was a big loss, but he and I developed this project together. And if you'll go back, the first 3 books came out in February. So mine is one of 3 books. And the other 2 books are really, really good, and really worth reading too. I don't know if Karis has them yet or not, but Rutgers was excited to have a queer imprint. This is sort of they were experimenting with this series. We have 5 other books in the pipeline, and we're looking for more. So people can, if you keep going, you'll see the website. My personal website that shows my other work is on the bottom, but the Q Plus Public website has a section that shows you how to propose a book title and what it is we're looking for. We're looking for material that, first of all, isn't getting addressed elsewhere, and second of all, that has a collaborative aspect to it. And we're looking for books where the visuals are equally important to the text, which is true of my books, certainly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that there's probably a lot of aspiring young writers out there who would really benefit from having their work shown in this setting, and especially with the focus on topics that are not generally talked about, or on kind of new topics in the queer community. I think this is a great series for people to know about, and for people to hopefully submit to. But so anyway, to wrap up, since we're at the end of our slides, I just want to thank you, E.G., so much for answering all of my tough questions and for giving us this talk and graciously showing us these slides. I want to open it up to audience questions, and I can go ahead and read from the chat if anybody has questions.
Can you take the slides down so that?
Yeah, let me go ahead and do that. I'll take the slides down, and if people want to see any specific slides, I can bring them back up. But okay, so I have a question from Nikki. Are you planning any other projects using archives or spin-offs inspired by this project?
I am not right now, but I did. This project roughly ended in 2014. And I have to say that I feel like one of the failures of my project is that I didn't come up. I felt like I was running a small not business, but a small enterprise of some kind, and that I didn't come up with a way to continue it. And the reason I felt like I should have is because so many people asked about how to do this. And I don't feel like I own the idea of matchmaking. I feel like it's something anybody could take into another archive, and maybe they are. But it wasn't something that I planned for per se. But what I did do after this was sort of by happenstance, the archives that I was working with started to travel to conferences, to shows, to different situations where I would take artifacts like Tina Takamoto's, some of Tina Takamoto's artifacts to a show in Manila, for example. And so I started to think of these as wandering archives. And so I did a whole series of works called migrating archives, where I dealt with archives crossing borders more easily than we can. And I also developed relationships with other queer archive organizations around the world, so that the GLBT Historical Society had a connection to the gala in Johannesburg, or to, the archive in Amsterdam. So I worked with, I think, about 12 or 13 different archives, and that generated different events and shows, and that went on until just a few years ago.
Great. Thank you for your question, Mickey. Does anyone have any other questions that they'd like to ask in the chat? If not, I can ask a question of my own. Okay, well, I'll wait for y'all to populate if you have anything. But so I do have one other question, E.G., and this comes from the conversation that we had with ER actually before this. And I think especially because we're here with Karis, and we see this kind of resurgence of young people interested in the archives and in kind of queer history specifically. So to what do you kind of credit this renewed interest in archives, and how do you feel about intergenerational archives? I know there were a lot of matches that were intergenerational. So what does that mean to you, and how does that kind of move this forward, move this kind of work forward?
In my matches with young people who were anywhere from 2 to 4 generations younger than me, I found that they were incredibly interested, but I don't think I was entirely aware that it was a phenomena. And if it is, I'm really happy about that. And I can only guess. I mean, I have to imagine, I think queer people need our history more than a lot of other people might. But I also have to imagine that our life in a digital ephemeral age might generate a desire for concrete history that you can sort of hold on to in some way. I realize a lot of archives are digital, but just the rapidness of our media, our access to media, our culture, our perception of the world is all just these rapidly shifting images. And I don't know, archives feel to me like a way to stop that or slow it down and really not forget. I feel like forgetting is our era is all about forgetting and moving on. And archives are really about looking back. And I think we can find ourselves in archives. I think young people, no matter what our age is, I think we can find ourselves in archives in one way or another.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that we see also this desire to have kind of personal collections and queer collections that aren't necessarily tied to classic institutional structures of archives. So I know that a lot of people are interested in community archives. Like I'm thinking in particular of the Lesbian Her Story archives, which is volunteer led and really kind of community led. So it's fascinating to see the kinds of different ways that queer people want to see their archive structured. in addition to kind of working with archives and remembering. But I also want to respect our time, and I would like to invite ER back into the conversation to close us out. And if, yeah, I can see him coming back in.
Thank you so much to both of you, and thanks to everybody in the chat for being with us. Yeah, we are finding at Caris that a lot of younger folks are thinking about their archive as people who are living in a digital world, but also as queer people who want to be remembered, and especially as trans people who want to be remembered. So it is an interesting moment, and who are excited about finding their lineages in archives. So I know more young people, under 25 today who know what an archive is than I certainly ever did when I was, under 25. So I feel like that's really exciting. And one of the things we were talking about in the green room is a person who donated her archive and her land to Caris to help us build a feminist center, a feminist retreat center, recently had a concert that she planned to be given posthumously in her honor. And I was thinking about what it takes for someone to know that they want an archive. They want a publicly available archive. And I'm just wondering, as we close out, do you have any advice for people, e.g., who maybe struggle with, I think I'm living an interesting life and I want it to be known, especially if I'm a queer person, but I don't want to be presumptuous or arrogant or whatever, how do we know whether our lives are worth preserving? Like, how do we, is that an arrogant thing to think, or should we be preserving our lives? And if so, how?
Yeah, I think that's the first, what I encounter is the first response a lot of times is, oh, I don't have an archive. And with students, I encountered that a lot. When I'd ask them to remember something from their childhood, they would often say, oh, I don't have anything interesting. And one of my participants, actually, who was, I think, 20 at the time, did a wonderful project where she created an archival dinner party and asked 9 people her age to create an archive and then to exchange stuff. I also worked with a group of queers in Dallas, Texas on a project and they were all different ages, but they were all Black, and they all were people who felt conflict with both the Black community in Dallas and the queer community, for obvious reasons in both cases. And so I had this opportunity to have access to the African American Museum there and to sort of facilitate them creating an archive that would be displayed in that museum. And so I went through a similar process of, oh, I don't have anything. But once I would talk to people and ask them questions, they would start to list things, and they actually brought those objects into the museum, and we came up with ways to display it. And it was everything from clothing and drag king outfits to letters and posters and remnants of a kind of activism. So yeah, I mean, maybe this place to start is to think, what would you be interested in finding that belonged to somebody else, and to not think about it being somebody famous, but just, what would you find interesting? And then how would you look at your stuff in that light? I need to follow my own advice, obviously. Actually, can I read something really quick that has to do with this?
Yeah.
That's in the book. Everyone has a lineage somewhere, but not all of us can touch it or talk about it. Things get in the way: poverty, exile, war, shame, silence, isolation. And if that is the case, where do we go to search for connection, to find antecedents, to identify our spot in the historical scheme of things? Community archives have become a crucial resource for preserving the most ephemeral histories. In the case of queer archives, preservation of the past is often a rescue effort against the wishes of families and communities who want to keep their privacy or institutions interested in image control. If they are saved at all, queer artifacts are often secreted away, held in reserve until people die, left in basements or anonymously passed on. While this shame slowly lifts, we still rely on institutions like the GLBT Historical Society and other archives to preserve evidence from our queer past. And I think trans history is a particular area that needs to be collected more because it's a newer awareness to a lot of people, and there are fewer archive organizations dedicated to that.
So that is a good segue to once again thank, of course, the Georgia Tech Digital Media Graduate Program and Morna Gerard, who is from the Gender and Sexuality Collections at Georgia State University. Georgia State is cultivating a beautiful trans archive there, and I'm very proud to be a part of it. And I know so many great people who are there. And we want to make sure that if folks want to buy the book, you can click this teal button at the bottom center of your screen to buy Matchmaking in the Archive from Caris. I did also drop Unsafe Words, which is the second book in the series, in the chat, so you can buy that as well. It is out now. And it really does help us when you buy event books from us, so thank you. And EG, thank you so much for being with us. Allie, thank you for being a wonderful interlocutor in this. And
thank you. This has been really, really wonderful.
So glad to know about your work. And
I want to visit Caris.
Yeah, come see us. And thank you all for watching with us. We really appreciate it. I hope that you all stay safe and well, and that we'll get to see you in person sometime.
Thank you.